I'm Ruth Hoberman, and I teach 20th century British literature and women's literature at Eastern. My research throughout my career has focused on the period between 1890 and 1950. I've written about modernist biography, about women's historical fiction, about Virginia Woolf, and most recently I published a book called Museum Trouble, Edwardian Fiction and the Emergence of Modernism. This book addresses the question of conflict within the Edwardian Museum and argues that novelists of the time responded to it in interesting ways. Some of the issues that were coming up had to do with what kind of art should be bought for national museums, which are now an established part of British life, who should decide what kind of art was going to be bought, how do you define aesthetic value, and how do you distinguish it from the commodities for sale in the streets outside the museum. What kind of response should viewers have to art? And finally, what kind of knowledge is it that museums generate? I argue that these questions matter to writers as well as to museum administrators and visual artists. I'm interested in the way the fiction of the period talks back to museums and in a way raises issues that define the Edwardian period, but that also anticipate some of the concerns of later writers like Woolf, Yeats, and Joyce. Some of the chapters involve questions like the construction of a national audience for art, the behavior of museum goers, and the kind of knowledge that museums generate. For example, I address Henry James's 1911 novel, The Outcry, in which he depicts an art expert trying to convince an aristocrat not to sell one of his great artistic masterpieces abroad. This was something that was very much a concern at the time. In 1905, the Duke of Norfolk put up this painting, which had been hanging in the National Gallery for years, for sale, and there was a tremendous amount of discussion as to whether this should be bought for the nation. Ultimately, the National Art Collections Fund, which had been established in 1903 for just this purpose, helped raise money that kept the painting in the National Gallery, where you can see it to this day, and where actually suffragette Mary Richardson slashed it in 1914 because she was offended, among other things, by its depiction of this kind of female beauty at a time when Mrs. Pankhurst, she said, was being imprisoned and her moral beauty being ignored. But in any case, this was one of the paintings saved by the National Art Collections Fund, and it's the kind of thing that the art expert depicted by Henry James in this novel is trying to do. There's another chapter that deals with what I call museum Gothic, in which art objects are depicted doing creepy things. They come alive on the walls of museums. And I suggest that these stories by people like Vernon Lee and M.R. James are dramatizing the conflict between the narrative of the object's origins, who created it, when, in what initial context, and the labels and narrative imposed on it by the museum, which in some contexts can seem very oppressive. There's another chapter where I talk about characters who get involved who respond to the paintings in terms of physicality rather than getting caught up in the aesthetic experience of the art. Gilbert Cannon, for example, has a novel in which characters fantasize about the possibility that this Venus in this very painting at night actually turns around and presumably exposes herself to museum goers when there's no one there. This is in a 1909 novel by Gilbert Cannon. Finally, some writers worry about the assumption that the museum conveys knowledge, that simply by looking at objects or consulting its sources, we get an unmediated, objective account of the world. There's a fascinating novel published in 1903 by Guy Thorne, in which a corrupt curator of the British Museum actually plants a fake tomb of Christ, convincing the world that therefore Christ was never resurrected, since he was actually buried in this tomb, and the world, convinced that Christianity is not true, behaves very badly. So that the novel kind of explores the power of the curator to define knowledge for the entire culture. This British Museum reading room is the setting of many, many novels during the time period. And in fact, there's one by Dora McChesney, published also in 1903, London Roses, in which a woman goes to the British Museum and feels alienated and is somewhat ridiculed by a German professor there who wonders what she's doing in what he calls this haunt of masculine learning. This character, I think, is anticipating Virginia Woolf's depiction of the British Museum reading room in her 1929 A Room of One's Own, where she complains that women going there feel like a thought in the bald forehead of the museum dome because it's so much male-dominated and the knowledge there is primarily produced by men. So ultimately what I'm trying to do is reconstitute conversations that I think have been forgotten between fiction that was published in popular periodicals, fiction that sold tremendously like Guy Thorne's novel, best-selling fiction, and also literary fiction. All of these things were produced at the same time during this period and at a time when the museum itself was a prominent institution, but one with a lot of conflict within it. And it's that conversation that I find so important in understanding the Edwardian period and its impact on later writers.